They found the report in a locked drawer, deep in a forgotten corner of the Admiralty. The paper was thin, brittle, the ink washed by salt air and time. On the cover was a list of names, each one crossed out, and a final handwritten note in an officer's meticulous script. Never released to public. Strategic significance. Decisive. Beneath that, only 3 words were underlined twice. München, boarding party. It was a file about a mission almost swallowed by the Arctic itself. A mission that began in fog, ended in fire, and altered the entire course of the naval war in the North Atlantic. A mission carried out by a handful of British sailors who boarded a German weather ship drifting through the White Sea mist. An unremarkable vessel at first glance, but carrying a cargo more valuable than gold. The Kriegsmarine's latest meteorological Enigma keys and codebooks. Documents that, once captured, could reveal German convoy routes, U-boat positions, and the breathing patterns of the Atlantic War. This story begins not with guns, but with weather. In the Second World War, weather was a weapon. The North Atlantic, cold, violent, unforgiving, was a battleground where storms could kill as swiftly as torpedoes. The side that predicted the storms that carved the seas held the strategic advantage. And in 1940 and 1941, Germany controlled the Arctic skies. From the northern fjords of Norway to the ice edge of Svalbard, the Kriegsmarine built a network of remote, heavily guarded weather stations. Their reports fed directly into the U-boat fleet stalking Allied convoys. The submarines relied on accurate forecasts to time their wolfpack attacks, surface for battery charges, and coordinate rendezvous across thousands of miles of ocean. Germany's meteorological chain was a system of lungs and arteries spread across the Arctic. Cut off the circulation and the U-boat arm would suffocate. The British knew this, and so did the Americans. But attacking the weather stations directly was expensive, difficult, and deadly. German garrisons protected them. Arctic storms shielded them. Ice fields blocked access for months. And yet, intelligence suggested something else, something easier to reach. The weather ships, small vessels lightly armed operating alone. The Germans disguised them as fishing trawlers or research craft. But they carried the essential cargo, the latest Enigma tables, meteorological cipher settings, and daily keyed weather transmissions. Each one a thread in the larger mesh of Kriegsmarine intelligence. Destroy a weather ship and you delayed the German forecasts. Capture one and you sabotaged their entire naval strategy. And in the summer of 1941, one ship in particular was transmitting deep from the Arctic waters near Jan Mayen Island. Her name was München. Her operators believed themselves safe, shielded by fog and distance, hidden by a war in which few looked toward the frozen north. They were wrong. The British Admiralty had committed a small force to track the ship, an improvised interception group centered around the armed trawler HMS Devonshire and a handful of other vessels. Their mission? Enter the Arctic fog, locate the weather ship, board her if possible, and retrieve every document on board before the Germans destroyed them. The stakes were extraordinary. In 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic was a struggle for life. Britain depended on convoys to survive. German U-boats were becoming more aggressive, more coordinated. The wolf packs roamed the central Atlantic with growing confidence, and the Royal Navy could not break the Enigma naval cipher Triton. Not yet. Without breaking it, they remained blind. But the weather ships, those floating laboratories, were careless. They followed strict routines, transmitted predictable signals, and often carried codebooks not just for weather transmissions but for naval ciphers as well. The logic was simple. If you controlled the weather, you controlled the fleet. And if the British could seize the full cipher package from a weather ship, they would punch a hole straight through German communications security. So the Admiralty tracked the positions. They listened to the faint Morse echoes in the Arctic night. They studied the direction of each broadcast, and as the weeks passed, a single vessel became the target, the München. She was a medium-sized weather ship with a crew of around 20. Her job was straightforward: maintain a constant flow of Arctic meteorological data for the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine. She carried an Enigma machine. She carried the weather key lists. She carried the naval cipher settings for auxiliary vessels. And she carried something even more valuable: the latest edition of the Kurt signal heft, a concise German signal book used to rapidly encode critical messages. If that book fell into British hands, Bletchley Park could break entire classes of U-boat communications. A single capture could save thousands of lives. And so, sometime in the late summer of 1941, the Royal Navy dispatched a boarding force. Sailors trained in Arctic operations, demolition, and close-quarters seizures. They traveled north, into a horizon that never slept, where the sun dipped and hovered just above the sea, cloaked in fog. After days of searching, they found the München. She floated like a shadow in the morning haze, her hull barely visible. The British closed in, engines muffled, hoping for silence. They did not want a battle. They wanted the ship intact. But the Germans had standing orders. If approached by enemy vessels, they were to destroy all classified material and scuttle the ship. That meant one thing: the British would have to board her before the Germans realized they were under attack. The Devonshire signaled to the boarding party. The sea was calm, though the fog clung densely to the horizon. The British lowered boats quietly. The boarding group descended. They advanced across the cold water, armed but hoping not to fire. As they neared the German vessel, confusion flickered on the faces of the weather crew. The Germans were meteorologists and sailors, not combatants. For a fraction of a second, no one moved, and that hesitation, less than the span of a breath, decided the mission. The British stormed aboard. They spread across the deck in practiced motion. One team cut access to the radio room. Another sealed off the engine bay. A third rushed toward the captain's cabin, knowing the codebooks would be hidden somewhere near the Enigma machine. The Germans reacted too late. Their signalers reached for the weighted bags designed to sink the cipher books, but the British were already on top of them. The fight was brief. Shouts echoed across the deck. No shots fired, no bodies falling. Only the heavy slamming of boots and the scraping of metal as sailors wrestled in cramped hallways. And then, it was over. The Germans were disarmed and assembled on deck. A handful of them stared in disbelief. The British had come from nowhere. The Arctic had hidden their approach as if conspiring with them. Now the boarding party raced through the ship. They knew they had minutes, maybe only seconds, before someone ordered the scuttling charges to blow. Weather ships often carried self-destruct mechanisms. If triggered, the entire hull could collapse into flame. The British smashed open the radio room. They seized the Enigma. They grabbed the daily key sheets, the weather cipher books, and the most important prize, the Kurt signal heft. Even in those adrenaline-soaked moments, they understood what they held. They stuffed the documents into waterproof bags, sealing them tightly, ready to be transferred to their own ship. Somewhere deep in the hull, they heard a bang, a muffled thud. Someone had activated the scuttling procedure. The British had no time left. They forced the Germans into the lifeboats, cut them loose, and scrambled back into their own boats. Behind them, the München began to groan. Smoke pushed from the lower decks. The hull listed. Seawater rushed through its compartments. Within minutes, the German weather ship sank. The Arctic swallowed her whole. But by then, the British were already pulling away. Documents secured, Enigma machine packed, mission accomplished. The sea around them bubbled with the final breath of the sinking vessel. They had captured the codebooks. They had stolen the German weather nets. They had taken the cipher settings the Kriegsmarine believed were safe, and they had done it under fog, silence, and speed. When the documents arrived at Bletchley Park, the reaction was immediate. The cryptanalysts knew what they were holding. Each page was photographed, analyzed, cross-referenced, and fed into the labyrinth of intelligence that helped unravel the Enigma cipher. Until then, the German naval codes had resisted sustained decryption. But the material from the München changed that. Suddenly, U-boat transmissions were no longer impenetrable. Their weather reports, the ones used to coordinate wolf packs, became predictable patterns. Their positions became traceable. Their rendezvous points became vulnerable. The Battle of the Atlantic began to shift. And yet the mission was not celebrated in newspapers. It was not announced in Parliament. It was buried under layers of secrecy because revealing how the British had broken into the German meteorological chain would risk everything. If the Germans discovered the breach, they would overhaul their codes, rewrite the books, and rebuild the Enigma system from scratch. For the rest of the war, the boarding of the München remained a secret known only to the highest levels of naval intelligence. But its effects were everywhere. Convoys began slipping through U-boat gauntlets more safely. Wolfpack plans collapsed before they began. Weather patterns that once favored German operations now worked for the Allies. And every successful prediction, every evasion, every interception echoed back to that fog-shrouded morning when a handful of British sailors climbed aboard a weather ship floating in silence. Meanwhile, the German Navy searched for answers. The sinking of the München was recorded in Kriegsmarine logs, but the loss was assumed accidental. The Germans had no idea their codebooks had survived. They believed them lost at sea, weighted and sunk. They believed the British had gained nothing. They were wrong. In the months that followed, Allied intelligence kept its advantage hidden. The Germans adjusted their ciphers occasionally, but the pattern of their meteorological sequences remained fundamentally traceable. Even small fragments captured from the München continued fueling Allied code-breaking efforts long after the ship vanished into the Arctic depths. The seizure of those documents created a chain reaction, one that stretched across the entire naval war. It influenced convoy schedules. It shaped admiralty decisions. It protected troop transports. It undermined wolf packs. And it gave Allied intelligence the insight it needed to manage one of the most delicate aspects of wartime logistics, predicting how weather would affect military operations. When Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, was planned, its timing depended heavily on accurate meteorological forecasts. The Allies had built a weather network of their own by then, but the experience they gained from years of studying German patterns, from years of reading intercepted transmissions that began with the München, contributed to the complex intelligence picture that allowed the invasion to proceed on June 6, 1944. The ripples of the weather ship boarding reached all the way from the Arctic fog to the shores of Normandy. But for the sailors who carried it out, the mission was just another entry in a long war. Their names were recorded in small handwriting, often in the margins. Over time, most were forgotten. Some survived the war, some did not. Their ship, an armed trawler made for war's rough work, returned south, collected frost on its hull, and sailed on. The Germans, meanwhile, continued their Arctic operations, but with increasing difficulty. As Allied forces seized more weather ships, ambushed stations in Svalbard, and disrupted northern broadcasts, the German climate network fractured. Eventually, only a handful of isolated installations remained. One of the last, Weather Station Haudegen, continued transmitting until September 1945, when its crew realized the war had ended months earlier. But by then, the outcome was decided. U-boats lost their strategic edge. Convoys gained a shield made not of steel but of information. The Atlantic, once deadly, became survivable again. And it all began with a boarding party stepping from fog onto a lonely ship in the Arctic night. The official file ends abruptly as if someone closed the folder mid-sentence. A brief concluding note was typed in the uneven keys of a wartime typewriter. This operation, though minor in appearance, contributed substantially to the development of Allied cryptanalysis. Without the material obtained from München, the naval campaign would have proceeded under significantly reduced intelligence capability. A small mission, a tiny ship, a short skirmish without gunfire. Yet from it thousands of merchant sailors lived. Convoys reached their ports and the war turned gradually toward the Allies. Sometimes the most decisive battles are not fought with armies or fleets. They are fought in fog, in silence, in the cold Arctic mist, by men who board a ship at dawn, seize a stack of papers, and vanish before anyone understands what has happened. History remembers the great clashes, Stalingrad, El Alamein, Midway, Normandy, but in the shadows of those colossal events are operations like the capture of the München. Operations that shaped the war from the inside, through information, secrecy, and the courage of small teams acting on the edge of the world. This was the mission that changed the weather war. This was the moment when fog became an ally. This was the morning when a handful of sailors stepped out of obscurity and quietly shifted the direction of the Second World War.